It was in the 18s when this case began that 3 twin sons were born, all bearing the faces of men, but their height was stunted and small. The cabin where they came into the world stood deep in the Ozark woods, where the air was heavy with silence and the roads were nothing more than dirt paths cut by wagon wheels. The family into which they were born had lived for generations in the same valley, bound to the soil, bound to each other, and bound to secrets that had never been spoken aloud. No stranger came to that place, and no neighbor dared to linger long when passing by, for there were whispers of oddness that clung to the family, whispers that stretched back to the earliest days when their forefathers had built the first rough cabin among those hills. The mother who bore the 3 sons was pale and thin, her body already worn from births before, and her eyes held a dull glaze as if she had seen too much of sorrow and too little of light. The father was a figure scarcely remembered beyond the valley, a man who kept to the woods and lived by trapping and gathering, seldom seen by anyone outside his bloodline. When the 3 sons came into the world, they cried in voices deeper than infants should have. And the midwife, who had been called in hushed secrecy, crossed herself and left before dawn, never speaking of what she had seen. For the boys were not as other boys. They bore the heavy brows of men, jaws too square for their age, but bodies that stopped short in growth, limbs small and crooked, as though nature had started a task and abandoned it midway. The years that followed in that cabin were marked by silence, for the family did not speak openly of what they knew. The boys grew, but only sideways, their height never reaching the stature of men, though their faces aged in strange ways. At 12 they looked as though they were 20, and yet their bodies remained small. At 20 they bore the look of old men, yet they could not lift the weight of a full-grown hog, nor stride farther than the porch without stumbling. Still, they were fed and clothed, hidden when outsiders came, and guarded by the mother who spoke little and the father who spoke even less. In those woods, generations had lived and died without leaving the valley, and with each generation, the branches of the family tree twisted back upon themselves. Cousin married cousin, brother lay with sister, and the line grew tangled until no one could recall where one name ended and another began. The 3 sons were the last fruits of that tree, and their birth was spoken of as a sign, though no one dared say sign of what. When travelers heard of them, they laughed, thinking it no more than a tale told by hillfolk to keep strangers from prying too near. But those who stumbled upon the cabin at dusk and glimpsed shadows on the porch told afterward of shapes that did not match their voices, and of eyes that gleamed too old for the bodies they wore. The land itself seemed to share in the family's decline. The soil grew thin, the corn stunted, the hogs born weak. Storms gathered often over the valley, and lightning split the oak trees as though the sky itself wished to cleanse the place. Yet still the family stayed, tied to their ground by a bond stronger than hunger, stronger than sense, a bond born of blood alone. The 3 sons, whose names were never recorded in any church book nor written in any ledger, grew to manhood without schooling, without friends, without the world beyond the hills, knowing of their existence. The mother aged swiftly after their birth, her body giving out before she had reached 40. The father dug her grave at the edge of the woods and said no words above it, for words had little meaning in that house. After her death, the cabin grew darker still, lit only by the fire that burned in the hearth through long winters. The father and his sons lived by hunting squirrels, by snaring rabbits, and by bartering hides when the need for salt or flour drove them to the nearest trading post. It was on such visits that rumors spread, for the trader saw the sons once and told of their strange look, their voices thick and low like men thrice their age, their stature no higher than boys of 10. From that telling, the whispers began to crawl beyond the valley, spoken in taverns and campfires, until the Ozark Cabin came to be named in secret as a place of shame. Years passed, and the father grew frail, his back bent from labor, his hair white before its time. The three sons, though small, grew restless, pacing the woods, wandering farther than before. They found no wives, for no family would give a daughter to them, and so the old cycle began again within the walls of the cabin. What had once been whispered in the shadows of ancestors was repeated anew, and with each turn of that wheel, the features of the bloodline grew more crooked, the minds more clouded, and the bodies more frail. The case that came to be spoken of in hushed tones among county officials began when hunters stumbled upon the cabin one autumn evening. They had followed a wounded deer through the thickets and found themselves near the clearing where the house stood. Smoke rose from the chimney and figures moved in the yard. They saw faces in the firelight that did not fit the forms that carried them, and they left without knocking, troubled by what they had seen. One among them spoke of it later to the sheriff, and though the sheriff dismissed it as wild talk, the story lingered. In time, it reached the ears of men who kept records, and men who asked questions. Thus the secret that had been bound to the valley for near a century began to seep beyond its borders.